Welcome everybody. We're going to have this is great. It's kind of an intimate session, but we'll have several people online, and we'll be able to interact a lot. It is my pleasure to welcome Deb Seligsohn. Deb is here as a visiting scholar, but Deb is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. She's just a phenomenal expert on Chinese politics and Chinese political economy, but really especially issues surrounding the environment, and not just with respect to China, but China and India and China comparatively. Deb has, and I'm sure you've read her biography, but just an incredible background first, and now as an academic. As we go a little bit farther back in Deb's career, she played a very prominent role at WRI, the World Resources Institute, really running their China program, and certainly the program on China energy and environment. And prior to that, Deb was a U.S. Foreign Service officer and served in a number of places, India, China, but in China ran the Office of Science and Technology, or was in charge of the operations surrounding science and technology and health at a very interesting time, right when SARS happened. So a really extraordinary range of knowledge and experience across the public sector, the NGO sector, and the academic sector. Today, Deb will be talking about the topic of clean before free, how an autocracy conquered air pollution in China. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Deb. Welcome.
So I will take off my mask so you can all hear me clearly, and especially with this YouTube thing also going on. But I deeply appreciate that you're wearing masks, because I'm starting to get nervous about numbers again, and I'm very much hoping I never get long COVID. This is my major ambition in life right now. I try to keep my ambitions to things that might materially affect my life. So, yes, this is my topic, is sort of what's going on in China and how have they managed to do this thing that so many people thought was impossible. So air pollution actually kills 1.8 million people in China each year. That's a number from the Health Effects Institute, which is up in Boston, that gets published in the Lancet's sort of every 10 years actual cause of death numbers. So it's a big deal, right? It's one of the major causes of death. And we expect this kind of poor outcome in an autocracy. What you see, the picture that's behind these words is, of course, the Pants building in Beijing through the smog on a particularly bad day. And that was more or less the view from my window, although this is not a photo that I took for much of the last time I was living in China for an extended period of time. But so we expect the poor outcomes in autocracy because we know civil society is going to be weak, because we expect that an autocracy is going to deliver private goods to an elite rather than deliver a great number of public goods, and because autocracies notoriously have poor information flows, that it's very hard for them to know what's going on down below, that local officials tend to lie, and you don't have something like local elections to hold them to an account, so leaders tend to be more in the dark, which of course is the theory that everyone now has about why Putin was so misinformed about his military. So this theory has a great deal of weight and is often applicable. And we also expect that politically connected and large polluters are going to be particularly able to evade enforcement, that they're the ones that have the easiest time. But this is a picture of Beijing in 2019 when I was visiting in the summer before COVID. And that is a photo I snapped from the Energy Foundation offices in the Civic building. And as you can see, the sky was blue. It was utterly gorgeous. And days like this are more and more frequent in China, right? Air pollution in China peaked a decade ago. So that's the puzzle that I'm going to try to answer is, you know, how is it that in this autocracy, air pollution is rapidly declining? This is a chart for sulfur concentrations, but I can show you the same kinds of things that other people have done for NOx and other pollutants. So air pollution seems to have been a success story in China, and the question is why? So the core of my research is the relationship between government and business in an autocracy, right? So rather than focusing primarily on the public or on civil society, I say, let's look at the polluters and look at their behavior. And one of the things about the Chinese approach to air pollution is they chose to focus very heavily on large polluters when they began. That has a lot of advantages because these large polluters are much easier to monitor because you can put monitors on them. They're not nearly as many. And every time you're successful, you get a big bang for your buck, right? You can reduce a lot of pollution per unit. And yet this isn't the approach that many countries have chosen. Most countries, if you look around the world, start with a focus on automobiles, which are the opposite of that, right? They're widely dispersed and difficult to monitor. And so it's interesting the way the Chinese have chosen to focus on industry, and I think is the core to why the Chinese have been much more successful to date than, for example, India. Even though actually, if you look, the Chinese started a bit later than India actually did in terms of starting to try to control pollution. So governments tend to be concerned about going after big polluters first. The first reason is because they're very influential, right? And it's not just that they have political influence, they're also big employers. So they worry about the impact they're going to have. And so the question I'm going to be looking at is specifically how did the Chinese government manage to address this, and what was it that made the Chinese so successful in what actually was a relatively unusual strategy. And I'm going to look sector by sector. And so the four sectors I'm looking at are power, oil and gas, steel, and cement. And what I'm going to do today is give you a pretty in-depth discussion of the power sector and then discuss sort of the basic outlines of what I'm seeing in the other three sectors. So the power sector is where we've seen the largest reductions in air pollution to date. It's also the single largest polluter, especially in the pollutant that I'm measuring for my studies, which is sulfur pollution. And the story that I want to tell you there is that there was a big breakup of the power sector in 2002. That before that, power was a single ministry monopoly, and then it got broken up into the big 5 power companies, creating competition for the first time. And what do you know? You have brand new emission standards in 2003, which are really the first meaningful emission standards in the Chinese power sector. And these have been huge. Within 6 years, sulfur, which was the main pollutant they were regulating, had dropped by half. And this was during a period when generation doubled. So it wasn't simply that they were using less, it was that they actually had substantially cut the amount. Did you have a question?
Yes. I know that the source is from the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection. How credible is that source?
I think it's very credible, actually. So first of all, if you look at that curve and then you look at the one I showed you a few slides back, and actually you can click, I can't see, so I won't do that. You'll see that the graphs look the same, and the other one is from ambient air numbers that come from satellite data. So the data, especially once you get to the city level, and here we're dealing with facility level data, data is really good. I think the emphasis on small differences and irregularities in data, the whole juking the stats game that a number of people have written on, gets overplayed as a policy matter. Because we're usually talking about plus or minus 10% in terms of accuracy. And honestly, when your numbers are 5, 10 times WHO standards, 10% really isn't that important if you're reducing. And what we're usually talking about is differences between districts within the same city. A bunch of the studies have compared different districts in Chongqing, but the overall Chongqing average is about correct. It's just that some districts are behaving better than others. So I'm honestly not that concerned about it. And in general, at any scale, the numbers between what the Chinese government reports and what you see in satellite data actually match pretty well.
Thank you.
And all the other thing is that the playing around stuff, the Chinese government is following that too. I mean, generally what you see is localities try to get away with stuff and then they get in trouble. It's not that this goes on forever, right? So that can be politically interesting, but in terms of getting to clean, I'm not convinced it's that important. So a similar decline by half in the US took 20 years. It was really from 1970 to 1990 that we got the same level of decline. So this is quite dramatic, unprecedented, and nowhere else in the world has done this in anywhere near the size or the speed with which the Chinese have cut some of these pollutants. And these are expensive reductions. This is not because they introduced some better technology. They put end-of-pipe pollution abatement equipment on all these power plants in China, and they actually ran them. So this is a dramatic change in the way these power plants are run. I mean, these are, if you've ever been to a power plant, to deal with sulfur is to put a huge extra piece of equipment in an extra building that you have to run. It's not some small item that you might do, and it has no economic value. You can use the waste products a little bit, but it's not paying for the cost of running the equipment. So the basic study that I'm looking at is standards and implementation in an authoritarian regime. So I'm going to look at 2 different tests in the power sector of sort of whether my theory, which is about whether the behavior of companies is really driving this, is the result. One looking at the standards and the second looking at the enforcement. So at the national level, we have these new tougher standards, and I have a qualitative study looking at how the standards got adopted. And then at the provincial level, we can look at enforcement and look at whether when there are more companies competing with each other, do we get better actual performance? So obviously we have to think about whether there's some other explanation for what's going on. The first might be, well, the technology just got better. And no, the technology that they're using is basically the same FGD, the scrubbers that have been used since the 1970s. Now, Chinese companies make them far more cheaply than American and European companies do, which I do think helped with the very rapid rollout of this equipment, but running it is still a significant cost. So if you go back to like 2003, when they started to put a few scrubbers around, the main complaint was, yeah, the government might subsidize them and they would put a scrubber on, but they wouldn't run it. But the big thing that we're seeing by 2010 is that they're all being actually run and the pollution is being abated, and that's a cost at the level of the plant. So it's not a real technology change. For certain pollutants, you might say it's economic growth that, but for these pollutants, we would expect more pollution, not less. This isn't something where just change, it isn't a structural change. There's actually more power being generated, not less. And then, and as I say, it's costly, so you need an incentive. And then the last one that we have to consider is civil society. Is it because of public pressure that this happens? But the thing about civil society in China is that it's concentrated in a very few areas, which have very little relationship to the areas where these reductions happen. And the reductions pretty much happen everywhere, is part of the story. So if we look at pollution, the red map gives you the concentration of pollution, of this sulfur pollution in China in 2010. And the data, I'm giving you a single year because the years don't really match for the different data sets. So I don't have a good way to do a panel with this. But what you can see if you look at the upper right hand, and now I'm going to turn around because I can't read my own screen. So the blue one is public interest NGOs, which are NGOs that might be concerned. And you can see that they're basically concentrated in a few coastal provinces in Beijing and in areas that are more about natural resources in the West. Because actually most public interest NGOs don't actually, if they work on the environment, they tend to work on sort of forestry and water, and they don't tend to work on air pollution to begin with. And then the bottom graph map shows air pollution complaints given to the Ministry of Environmental Protection, because in 2010 they happened to actually report the number of complaints. They've reported the number of complaints for a number of years, but they happened to split them out by type. And so we know how many were on air pollution. And what you can see is that, I mean, you can see it's Guangdong and Jiangsu that have the most complaints, right? So it's where people are rich, not where the pollution is the greatest. But that isn't where pollution was reduced. So there just isn't much of a relationship between where the public is energized and where these reductions took place. So the theory that I'm advancing is that it's really whether companies compete with each other that affects whether the government is effectively able to change their behavior. And what I'm looking at here is the Stigler-Pulseman model of corporate capture. So the idea of Stigler-Pulseman, which was originally developed in the United States in the 1930s, is that companies will try to actually control regulation. And so if you have a monopolistic company, they're obviously going to try to avoid regulation. But also, and this will become very important in this story, if there is regulation, companies will try to use that regulation to their competitive advantage. And this was developed out of regulations in the trucking industry in the US in the 1930s. But the Stigler-Pulseman was developed with the idea that one of the key actors in the theory was elected representatives, that legislators were very important to the behavior model. And what I want to show you is the same thing happens in a country where there are no legislators. So the thing about regulation is that they're going to use it for their own advantage, and that incumbents are going to be able to benefit from regulation. So basically, companies have two strategies. They can either adhere to regulation or they can choose to violate it, right? So if you think about Chinese companies and you think about the period leading up to these regulations, the first thing they want to do is convince the government not to pass the regulation at all. That's going to be the optimal strategy for them, because then they don't have this cost and they can just go on doing what they want. If they are powerful, especially if they're a monopoly, they may choose, even if there's a regulation, to ignore it, right? And that was the issue that Chinese companies back in 2002, 2003 were being accused of, right? That even if you have these regulations, they never follow them. And that works only to the extent that nobody else shows that the regulations are easy to follow. And so your other option is to adhere to the regulations and perhaps use them to drive some of your competitors out of business. And so that's where adherence becomes a strategy as well. So what happens? So why is it so much more difficult to create regulation when companies are monopolies? So as we all know, monopolies have market power, right? And they're able to manipulate the supply. They actually choose to produce less at a higher cost, right? But they also control, and that in and of itself makes governments nervous, especially when we're talking about energy, because they know the public wants more energy at a lower price, and they're dealing with this powerful company who keeps telling them it's expensive and all of this. And they're able to control the information because the government has no window into how much their real costs are, how much putting pollution abatement equipment on would cost, whether it really will drive them out of business, whether it will cause energy shortages. When there's only one company, this is all information that's very difficult for the government to get a window into. And so it makes it hard for the government to know what to do. But the thing is, once you have more than one company, state-owned enterprises in China compete with each other. And I think this seems like a group where a bunch of us have been in China and we all have had that experience, but that's often overlooked sort of outside of China, that in fact state-owned enterprises vigorously compete. And they also have to compete for all kinds of other things like permits from the government. So they compete for market share, they compete to be given permission to build new plants, which they're going to need for something like power plants or oil refineries. And so they're going to be looking for any advantage they have. So when we look at the national level test, my hypothesis is that the standards are going to be tougher if the sector is more competitive. So the first part of the story is that the sector was broken up, right? So in December 2002, one company was split into 5. And the nice thing for me, for my study, is this is a completely exogenous shock. It has nothing to do with pollution. The reason the government broke it up was about that supply problem. They wanted more electricity. The single monopoly power producer had not been building power plants at the rate that the government wanted. And as you saw from my earlier slide where I said generation doubled over the 6 years where pollution went down, the government got what it wanted. It got this very rapid increase in the number of power plants. And it created a lot of churn. So first they split the one company into 5. They also are allowing new entrants to come in. Old players are being pushed out, especially some of the local companies sort of expand all over the country. Other ones get pushed out. There's a lot of action going on. And so by 2008, what we see is these big 5 companies that were broken up control about 45% of the market. And that's actually been fairly constant since. So when we look at concentration, we have this single state power company before 2002, and then we have 5 company dominance after that. And those are the big 5 that have, some of them have since now been remerged into other things. And then since then, the top 5 have controlled about 45 to 50%. And our dependent variable is the standard, what they're controlling. So before 2003, there was no control for either SO2 or NOx. In 2003, they bring in a meaningful standard which requires FGDs on all Chinese power plants, basically. In the United States, we have something called low sulfur coal, where we're actually able to meet our standards in half the country without FGDs. China does not have that. So everywhere in China now has this equipment. And then in 2011, they bring the standard up to the US and European level with both more stringent SOx controls, but also they bring in NOx controls, which are more expensive even than the SOx because they involve some expensive metals in the equipment. And then in 2016, and this is, I mean, I had started this project before this happened, so this was the real surprise of the study, is that the Chinese brought in something called the ultra low emission standard, which is by far the most stringent air pollution standard for the power sector anywhere in the world. And so if I put it on a timeline, you can see I put the three sort of eras on top. You know, you have one country dominance, and then you have a period where these big five are basically dominating any competition. And since about 2008, you've had this much more fluid situation where there are lots of companies coming in and going out. And we have these three sets of standards, 2003, 2011, and 2016. So the 2003 standard comes in right after the power companies get split up. And frankly, I think that the split up companies were basically struggling to figure out what they were doing and probably not all that paying attention to this new standard. And what happens is they do their usual of ignoring it. They get called into some work meetings. The sulfur standard gets put into the 11th five-year plan in 2006 as a hard target, and the companies are told, you better do this. And they're all a little bit surprised, but they comply, and you start to get this huge build out of FGDs between 2007 and 2009. And when I talked to the guy who wrote the standard back in 2003, I said, you know, did this have an impact? And he said, well, yes, because think of one company as like a fist. It's very difficult to move. But if you have five companies, it's like fingers, and it's really easy to pull off just one. I don't know how easy it is to pull off fingers, but that's what he said. But you can definitely hurt someone more easily when their hand is like this, right? So I think they got them in a little bit under the radar, but the fact that there were five companies made it easier to do that than when there was only one company. So then the Chinese standards are generally reviewed every 5 years to see if they should be improved or changed or eliminated or whatever that should be done. So they started a review process actually in about 2009, so it was a little later than that. They solicit input from companies, from governments. There's usually a public comment opportunity, and then the standards folks, which included the then Ministry of Environmental Protection, sat down with all the major companies as well as representatives of some of the big provinces that are big coal producers like Shanxi. And they explained that what they wanted the 2011 standard to be, that they were going to have this standard that was the equivalent of the US and European standard. And the companies all said, we can't do that, right? It's going to be too expensive. China is a developing country. How can we have the same standards as the US and Europe and Japan? And they said, and so then the ministry explained to them that while China was poorer, it actually had a much higher concentration of people living in close proximity to all these power plants. So in terms of air pollution exposure, it was a much greater issue than it was in the West, and therefore they thought that an equivalent standard would be a good idea. And one of the companies said, okay, we get it, we'll go along with you. The minute they do that, they reveal information to the government, right? Suddenly the government knows, okay, if one of the companies says they can do it, they all can afford it. And so the complaints, which were all about state of development and affordability and this kind of stuff, got wiped away by a company who saw a strategy of looking greener than their competitors in a desire to get more permits to build more power plants, because China was still building a lot of power plants. So the fact that there were competitors gave the government a window into what the real costs were and whether compliance was going to be workable or not. they bring in this new standard in 2011. And I thought that was going to be my story. But then we get to this ultra low emission standard. So this is a standard that's proposed by industry, not by the Ministry of Environmental Protection, not by anyone else in the government, not by the civil society that doesn't mostly exist, or by academics. And the main supporters were two companies. One was Zhejiang Energy, which is one of these provincial power companies that had become a big player with expanded. They built a ton of power plants out in Xinjiang and like a national powerhouse, but a new company that's challenging the traditional ones. And the other was Shanhua, which at the time was mostly a coal producer, but was starting to build power plants as well, and has since bought one of those big five power companies and is now the world's largest power company as well as the world's largest coal company. And so why would they do this? Well, first of all, they wanted to continue to do coal-fired power because they were starting to get worried, especially on the East Coast, that local governments were not so thrilled with were starting to think that coal-fired power was all too dirty and that they had to shift away to gas or something else. And the second thing is they're very big, they're very well financed, and if they raise the standards, they're going to drive some of their competitors out of business, which is the core of the Stigler-Pulseman idea, right? That for a certain kind of company, regulations are their friends, right? And so they advocated this, and the Environment Ministry did not want this regulation because they saw reducing emissions in the power sector still further is quite expensive, and that they could get a lot more bang for the buck in terms of investment by moving on to other sectors. As far as they were concerned, once they got to American and European standards, they were done with the power sector, and they were going to move on to the other sectors I'm going to talk about, oil and gas and steel and whatnot. And instead, they were stuck having to write new regulations, new standards, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, some of the interior provinces, the big coal mining provinces, were concerned about the costs of the new regulations. But the thing is, Shanhua and Zhejiang, they won. China brought in this new standard that is the most expensive in the world. So, and the most stringent. So at the national level, we find that the lower concentration provides this opening which then enables certain industry allies to team up with the government. But then the industry actually uses this regulatory opportunity to start creating barriers to entry for weaker players. And so that's the story from the national level. So if we move on to the provincial level, which is of course enforcement is all at lower levels, what I'm looking at is outcomes. So my assumption is that when you see lower emissions, it's because enforcement is higher. And I have to make that an assumption because I can't prove that. So my hypothesis is that is basically that the emissions will be lower when there are more companies, because the companies can't collude. Again, think about the information problem, that the government finds it very hard to know how big an impact enforcement will be when they don't have a lot of companies. So the test is to look at provincial variations. So the advantage for me is that coal-fired power basically in China is on a separate provincial grid, that each province basically supplies its own power, even though there's this bigger state grid or southern grid that sort of has some control. Power doesn't move across provincial lines that much, and most of the power that does are like these big hydro projects where they're dedicated lines, but that doesn't affect my pollution numbers because the hydro doesn't cause pollution. And the other thing is that sulfur doesn't move very far. So that's why sulfur is useful to me. The vast majority of sulfur pollution stays within 100 kilometers of the plant. So provinces can regulate the pollution that they face, right? And they consume the product as well, which is super useful for us. So I measure the concentration by a Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which takes the market share and adds it up, basically. So it just creates a number for the market share. So if there were only one company, it would have a very high number, and if there are a lot of companies, it's a much lower number. And then my dependent variable is the amount of sulfur emissions abated each year. Now, one of the things that's super useful in power, and I think is another reason why the power sector went first and had fewer hiccups in a lot of ways than other sectors, is because there's actually this perfect enforcement loop. So what the Chinese government did in the period basically 2007 to 2009 is they went around, they put on all these scrubbers. They also put on continuous emissions monitoring equipment on all the power plants. And this continuous emissions monitoring equipment then is connected directly into every level of government. There's a huge difference between China and India, where they only connect it to the local government. Big problem. But so they can see it at the district level all the way up to the national level. But they also connected it to State Grid, the purchaser of that power. So State Grid can see whether the power plant has its emissions monitoring equipment on or not. Why does that matter? Because when the government announced that that the power companies had to abate pollution, they also allowed them to charge an extra fee for the cost of the pollution abatement process. And so there's a base fee, and then there's an additional fee for pollution abatement. And they cleverly put the profit in the additional fee rather than in the base fee. So if you only get the base fee, your power plant is not making any money. Your power plant is only making money when you're running the equipment. Now, it would be to your advantage to not run the equipment but still get the fee. But because the grid company can monitor whether you're running the equipment or not, and it's cheaper for the grid company to not pay the fee, they're always watching. And so you get a self-reinforcing loop, which only exists in the power sector, right? Because the government sets all the prices, and because there's only one buyer in any area. So it creates this perfect self-reinforcing loop where the big cost to the power company of not running the equipment is they get paid at this lower rate. And when I was working on this project, my advisor, Susan Shirk, was always asking me, well, has anyone been sent to jail? And I'm like, no, nobody ever gets sent to jail for this kind of stuff. Really few people do in America either. I was like, but when I talked to my advisor at Tsinghua, he said people in power companies have gotten fired. And that's where the pain point is, because if they don't run the equipment, they lose money, and the power plant managers get fired. And so this is critical to why power was the first sector. So just to give you the data, so this is the emissions. You can see overall it peaked around 2006 and then went down. A lot of variation by provinces, up, down, and which way and what way. Similarly with concentration, there's a sort of general trendward downward, but there's a lot of variation between provinces. So when I run a regression, the concentration is the top bar, and you can see it's both important. It's sort of 5%, a 1% change in concentration leads to a 5% change in sulfur. So it's quite real, and it's statistically significant at the 90% level. And the other basic things that you might think, like, oh, well, how politically connected is the party secretary, or was it about how industrial the province is, or their GDP type growth, or whatever? None of those things well, actually, GDP matters. That's why we control for it. But the others turn out not to matter, especially all the political variables that we tested. So that's the power sector. And in some ways, power is the easy case because there's so many power producers, and because of this clever system where they can set up this self-enforcing financial system. And they're constantly needing new permits and things like that because they build so many new power plants and things compared to, say, how many new oil refineries you would build. But what we've seen over time is that enforcement in other sectors has improved as well. And so that's what I'm looking at. And in both oil and gas and steel, I think this competition model also applies. And so now I'm going to explain to you how. So in oil, the Chinese oil industry has been dominated by two major firms forever, right? CNPC and Sinopec. But there's this smaller group of companies called teapots that were always there. The government many times was trying to get rid of them. They're a product of, they're mostly in Shandong and some in Jiangsu province, basically. And they're a product basically initially of the structure of the Liaohe oil field, where the oil was very sort of spread out. And so the government had all these little ones that were originally, run by local governments and now sort of run as local state-owned enterprises. And basically these teapots were always a problem. They were dirtier than the majors. And because the other thing is China also has independent gas stations. So when you're on major highways, you'll see your Sinopec or whatever sign. But if any of you have ever been on the back roads of Yunnan or whatever, you'll see some gas station with no sign or whatever. And those independent gas stations, they can't buy their fuel from Sinopec and PetroChina, and they buy it from the teapots. So the teapots both had sort of a different reason for being, and they had a different set of buyers, all of which were kind of at the margins. But they were really dirty, and so there were constantly discussion about kind of getting rid of them. But the teapots started to think about a different, oops, sorry, did I just, I can't see my own screen.
Can I help you out?
Yeah, you might, let me just try escape. Oh dear, what happened? I don't know why that did that. Yeah, if you could take a look at my
And you are trying
to
get back to
just run the there's reading glasses.
see it. I'm not sure what happened there.
Yeah.
Maybe just taking the plug in and have to reset it back to where it was.
Oh, that's probably the simplest way to do it.
Sometimes.
No. I don't know what that.
If you take the point to the bottom, does a PowerPoint pop up then?
The PowerPoint is on my
It's
screen.
a mirroring thing, right? There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
You see it?
Oh, there.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, sorry. This is where my eyes become a problem. I'm only seeing at one distance at the moment. Okay, so Okay. So in 2013, the teapots are getting more and more worried that they're going to be in trouble because they're the dirtiest of the refiners. And so they come up with a new strategy, which is not just to improve their performance to Sinopec and PetroChina level, but to actually improve it to the level the government has been pushing for a while and the big refiners have been pushing against. So the level I'm talking about here is actually the quality of the fuel. So the story, as you probably know, China uses the European system for fuel ratings, Euro 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, except they call them China 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And actually some of them are slightly better than their European equivalents because they add in a few California extras on some of them. But so they were pushing, so the thing is, once you get beyond Euro 3 for vehicles, it's really important that the fuel be as good as the equipment in the vehicle. That you can't just mandate it for the vehicle manufacturers, you actually have to have a matching fuel standard, because if the fuel is still dirty, the vehicles can't actually handle it. That the things like the catalytic converters and some of the other equipment will get destroyed. Once you have catalysts in there, they can get destroyed very easily, especially by having a lot of sulfur in your fuel. And so the big push was to get diesel fuel to the Euro 4 standard. And Sinopec, PetroChina were pushing back against this. And the government really had no window into what was going on because the Standard Setting Institute for the oil and gas industry was actually housed within Sinopec and was literally on the campus of the main Sinopec facility in Beijing. So when they said, no, it's too expensive, we can't do it, the central government really had no window into what was it really going to cost. And of course, you worry a lot if you reduce fuel supplies, that's all going to be about, getting goods to rural areas and your trucking industry and all this kind of stuff. So there was this problem which the teapots realized they could use to their advantage to be able to stay in business. And so one of these teapots in Shandong actually decides to raise its standard to this Euro 4 standard that no one else had done. And it just did it in 2013. And then another one of the teapots that was literally across the road, because I happened to visit that one first, saw what was going on over there and said, oh, we could do that too. That's a really good idea, and maybe that will ensure our longevity. And so the teapots made this shift, and in 2015, the government not only brought in the new standard that they'd been avoiding, but they told all the teapots that if they met this higher quality standard as well as a minimum size standard, they got rid of some of the super teeny tiny ones, they would be allowed to import crude oil for the first time. Prior to that, they had to buy all their crude from Sinopec and PetroChina, which of course the big companies sold to them with a profit built in. So these guys were always at an economic disadvantage, which, as I say, then went to these independent gas stations in rural areas, which, it was all about sort of the smaller guys getting hurt all across the board. And so the government used the import permits to raise everybody up, to put a lot of pressure on Sinopec and PetroChina that, you guys are really going to start losing market share if you don't get your act together. And it worked. And not only were those new standards adopted, but then Euro 5 and Euro 6 came in smoothly. And I guess this is probably a little hard to see, but basically there'd been this constant series of delays. I mean, this standard was supposed to go in 2010, and it wound up being all the way in 2015. And then since then, it's been smooth. And it really was these crafty upstarts really sort of revealing information that the government did not previously have. And so then very briefly in the steel industry, I don't have as much of a story, but you can see a similar thing happening. So steel is really tough because, first of all, it's so geographically concentrated where it's produced that local governments are very protective. And it also is an international business. So the companies arguing, look, we have these costs and things like that. It's even more difficult for the central government to get a sense of what's feasible and what's not feasible. But if we look at concentration in the steel industry, you can see that the two times when they bring in new standards, which are sort of in 2012 and 2017, are when concentration starts to go down in the industry. And so I think there's really a similar story going on that both that when supply is sufficient, but also when the companies are feeling pressure from each other, it's easier to bring in standards. Now, cement is a completely different story, and I think this is more about the larger story I want to talk about, sort of adapting to the fact that not all these industries are the same, but that they've been very methodical about sort of going through industry by industry and coming up with a way that works. So the thing about cement is that it's produced and sold locally. So you have different cement all over. And the technical fixes are not that great. That it's really dirty, even when you upgrade the technology. But the thing about cement is that it's air pollution is worse in the winter in China than in the summer, right? And on the other hand, cement there's more demand for in the summer than in the winter because of when construction happens. And so the solution that they've had is to run most of the plants only part of the year. And that's been the way most of the cement industry is regulated. There are technology specifications, but those aren't enough to totally solve the problem. So a lot of the way they solve the problem is by just turning off most of the cement plants throughout the winter. Now, I will say that fits in with what Denise van der Kamp would call brute force regulation. And one of the things that I think we've seen is in areas like oil and gas, like steel, and especially in the petrochemical industry, a few years ago, a lot of the localities were using this turn off, turn on, turn off. It's really a bad idea for any industry with highly sophisticated chemical processes. So like in the petrochemical industry, this turning it off and turning it on was creating much more safety problems than it was solving pollution problems. So I think what we've seen over time is in areas where you can use technology and you can use regulation to reduce emissions, the government has become much more comfortable with that. But in areas where that just isn't going to work, like in cement, that sometimes these very basic ideas like just turning it off can be the simplest solution. So my overall sort of point is that companies are important political actors, that these companies really do compete with each other, and that the government's been able to use that quite effectively to bring in the kinds of policies that it wants, including these pollution policies. And thus, even in an autocracy, we see an improvement in public goods provision, even though a lot of the theory seems to be that we shouldn't. So that's what I have for you.
Thank you. We have some time for questions. Maybe I'll ask the first one and then we'll open it up. So this is great. Do I need to know anything about the Chinese system really for this to work? So I guess what I'm asking is, you began by saying we should expect better outcomes in democracies. would we expect at similar levels of concentration in industries, similar kinds of outcomes in democracies, different? And alternatively, is there anything particular about China that you need to know about China to make this outcome work? Or is it really just about concentration?
Well, I think concentration is important to why it worked. Unless there were people in the government who wanted to have pollution abatement, you don't have the spur to start it, right? So the first thing is there was this group of people in the Ministry of Environment who've been trying for years to get decent regulation in. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and I do have this all in the book, is you have an environmental bureaucracy that is quite extensive in China, right? So, and this is a huge difference with other developing countries, right? That you have not only, I mean, it was SEPA before 2008, and then Ministry of Environmental Protection, then MOEF, but then you have it at the provincial level, and you have it at the county and the city level, and then down even at the district level. And like if we're comparing China and India, that's the biggest difference, is they don't have anyone below the state level. So China has the ability to enforce. But what's really interesting, as India has become more interested in enforcing air pollution, is I presented this at, it was right before COVID. It was like the last thing before COVID. I was at a seminar at Columbia, and I was sitting next to the head of the biggest power company in India, and I sat down after explaining this thing about how compliance can be a tool for competition, and he said to me, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. So, and at the same conference, there was a guy from Mexico talking about the gas industry that was also a story about how competitors were using regulation to their advantage. So I think the problem with the democracy autocracy distinction is that's what it looked like in the developed world, right? Because everybody was comparing basically Western Europe to Eastern Europe. But I think once you get into the developing world, it's not obvious that that's the right distinction at all. But I also think nobody's really thought about the advantages of antitrust or competition policy for helping bring in effective regulation in developing countries. And I think it's a very useful tool.
I guess in the back of my mind, though, I was really thinking, do we see a similar phenomenon, say, in the United States or in advanced industrial economies, where there's competition in the sectors you're talking about? Do companies compete for more regulation?
Well, that's where the story starts. That was the whole Stigler story of the trucking industry in the United States. Yeah, companies in the US do this all the time. I mean, and if you look at everything, I mean, that's the story of like why hairdressers are regulated in the US. They use it to drive out their competition, right? I mean, hair braiding is regulated in many states in the United States. So the basic Stigler-Pulseman model is highly effective in showing what goes on in democracies. It's just that the initial model has a legislator as a key actor, and it works even without one.
Great, thanks. Questions?
If I can ask the first one, I just want to, could you elaborate a bit more of how it turns into a for-profit competitive advantage to be greener from one power producer from the other, in addition to the charge on pollution abatement? Before that was put in place.
Yeah. Basically, because they all want permits to build new plants. And so they want to, so it's about pleasing the government, right? That I mean, to the extent that they can get them without doing it's sort of branding, basically. Is if there's only one company, they're going to get all the permits because who else is going to do it? But once there are a bunch of companies, if they go to these to the central government or even provincial and local governments and say, we're the cleaner ones, we'll do a better job for you, that's attractive to the government, right?
So it's within the public procurement processes, they evaluate the
So it's
bids.
not procurement, it's a permit to build the plant, right? You can't build a power plant in China without getting a permit to build the power plant, right? So it's not public procurement, it's permitting.
And they would not get the permit if they were slightly less green, even though you say they split them into 5 also, or primarily to more rapidly increase energy production.
Right, but the one that wanted to show itself green was as big as any of the others, right? I mean, so they go into these localities and they compete to see who gets to build. You know, localities would be like, we need a new power plant, and then Huadian and Huanan will show up and say, we want to build your power plant, and so the localities are choosing who, and then they also need it's gone back and forth, but they generally need central government approval as well. So having a big fancy demo project showing that you have the greenest one can help you with NDRC and the Energy Commission and all this kind of stuff. So so not every company thought it was good branding. At that moment, one of the companies thought, this is how we're gonna get an edge. Maybe another company thought, oh, we have a political connection to some guy, right? I mean, they all have their different ways they're trying to get edges, but they're constantly looking for some kind of edge over their competitors. And if the government structures things right, then being greener can be the edge.
Do you see a similar scholarship and works from Chinese researchers as well, or is it a very niche topic that you don't see in the research community very often?
So I haven't seen as many Chinese researchers really working on the political economy in this area as much as on more the technical side. And also there's a lot of sort of modeling for the future rather than explaining what's happened. But I may be missing some things.
I remember on the graph of pollution complaints, most of them are coming from the wealthy areas by quite a substantial margin. Why didn't that change anything? Why didn't wealthy areas get less pollution?
Because it's not a democracy.
But surely the wealthy people have influence.
Well, I mean, not that much. I mean, it's not that clear. I mean, what the impact of public participation is in a country with no mechanism for the public to actually affect the fate of politicians, right? I mean, the thing about air pollution is people complain about it a lot, but I don't think there's ever been a public demonstration about air pollution anywhere in the world, right? It isn't something that draws people out onto the streets anywhere, right? So it's not a sort of regime stability concern. But I think it is, I do think somewhat behind this is sort of the eco-developmental state that it's the Chinese leaders that want a cleaner China, right? And I think that's been true all along, but it's especially true of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping's been interested in environmental improvements since he was in Fujian in the 90s. And Fujian in the 90s was kind of a model in terms of making environmental improvements early. So, and that's the other thing is, yeah, it's not all wealthy people. I mean, as people get wealthier, they want more ecosystem services of all kind, right? They want cleaner air, they want national parks to visit, they want all this stuff. And one of the things I think gets neglected is that includes all the people who work for the government, right? Because on average, especially at the central government, the people who work for the government are wealthier than the average Chinese. They're very middle class, and so their preferences are middle class. So I mean, my experience, you know, spending years talking to Chinese bureaucrats is that they especially by the early 2000s, they were interested in a cleaner environment, right? So that wasn't so much where the pushback was coming from.
I was wondering, so I grew up in India, and then when I lived in Beijing, I learned about air pollution. And that was the time, I think it was in 2017, 2018, where New Delhi had an AQI of over 1,000, but we didn't know how much because they couldn't read more than 1,000.
Well, it's not that relevant once it gets that high, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just kind of wondering, to the extent that the Chinese government is interested in prioritizing reduction in air pollution, then this kind of permit competition works. So I don't know if, could you say something about how much of international attention on the problem of air pollution helps in prioritizing for governments? Like, it doesn't seem to have done that in India. I don't know if...
A bunch of things. So first of all, I mean, the whole time I was in China, like all through, especially in the early, I mean, I was first in China in the 80s, but in the early 2000s, when everybody was talking about air pollution in China and also saying it was hopeless and the Chinese were never going to improve and all of this, I kept pointing out to people that it was actually, at that point, no worse than it was in India. I mean, it wasn't that India was worse at that point. And people would like act like I was crazy. I mean, and these are usually Westerners, right? I'm like, it's the same in India. And actually, if you look at the numbers in Nairobi or in Lagos, it's going to be the same as well, right? And my experience of international attention is international attention becomes particularly intense when the New York Times bureau chief has young children. And if you look at the period when air pollution in China was covered constantly in the New York Times, new baby. When you look at the period when it was covered constantly in New Delhi, several young children. And so I'm not convinced that that drives the needle on behavior in either country. So the thing about China is the air pollution peaks in about 2011. But what I hope I've shown you with all these regulations that they were bringing in 2003 and changing the 5-year plan in 2006 is that that peak was the result of years of work. It wasn't because people, so the first sort of airpocalypse event that the public became very loud about in China was in 2010. You know, SEPA and the Ministry of the Environment have been working for years and years to get to the point where they were going to be able to do something about that. It isn't this sort of overnight kind of thing. So the international attention got super intense in that period, like 2010 to 2015. But the work had been going on for years, and the standards that made the difference were already in place by then. So that's that story. I think the Chinese care about international attention in a couple of ways. First of all, I think the Chinese government wants attractive cities. And yeah, I think they would like them to look good to visitors or whatever, but I think it's more about when Chinese people go out to the rest of the world. I think the Chinese government wants them to be able to come back and say, yeah, Beijing and Shanghai look just as good as Paris and Rome, you know? And so I think it's more about their own feeling of pride and what being a developed country is about, that they want to be developed in every way. And I think that was a dramatic shift in 2003 in the aftermath of SARS. There was this sense of development is not just about economic growth anymore. It's about health, it's about welfare, it's about all these other things. And it took a couple of years for that to also be about the environment, but I think that change happened. I think India is still in many ways in the midst of that conversation, and there's still a lot more of the, well, you know, developing countries and what can we do and what can't we do kind of conversation in India than there is in China today. But I do think that it's moving. I think I'm sort of waiting for the Indian government has delayed similar regulations on big power plants and big emitters. I think they're now supposed to go into effect in 2024. And I'm interested to see what they do because in particular, the Thermal Power Corporation has been testing different scrubbers and other stuff. My sense of what happened in India is very early on, you get regulations on vehicles going all the way back to, I think, the 90s. And, I'd have conversations with people in New Delhi, and I'm like, but vehicles are not that high a percentage of total pollution. That you have, first of all, you have these big emitters like power, aluminum, steel, all this smelting in the area north of New Delhi and stuff like that. And then you have all the pollution of poverty, right? You have people burning anything, right, to keep warm. And so first of all, you need to get enough modern fuel to people. I mean, that's the other problem in India is that there's still plenty of people that don't have access to modern fuel. And nobody's going to care about pollution if they're still burning straw and dung, right? You need to ensure that they have access to electricity and gas and things so that they're actually able to have that conversation, right? And so, you go out to an area like Bihar that has 7 power plants in the whole state or something. I can't remember. It's some crazy, this is a state of over 100 million people. And they say, well, actually, there's no more demand. But the demand is based on this whole structural problem with the distribution companies all being bankrupt, so they can't buy more power. It's just a mess. And so until you figure out the structural problems with the power sector so that people can get enough power, and until you actually have regulators at the local level, so that the Chinese, these continuous emissions monitoring equipment on Chinese power plants are physically at the power plant, and the local Environmental Protection Bureau people come around and check that the locks on them are still sealed because the power plant's not allowed to go in and manipulate them. You do not have people in India. There's no one whose job that is, right? This isn't about shirking. This is about a level of bureaucracy. It just doesn't exist. The Indian bureaucracies, especially these, the Central Pollution Control Board, has all been about sort of a high-level elite group of people. It's not about this mass of people at the local level, which is what the Chinese bureaucracy is. And so they brought in SEMS in India, but by all accounts, they're doctored. The local companies just play with them. And the data only goes to the local level. It doesn't go all the way up to the national level. So there's nobody checking the work. But I'm still hopeful that over time it's going to change. But I think there are a lot of structural reasons why it's slower.
Time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, thank you for your presentation. And I wasn't here for the first part of the presentation, so my question might be slightly off the topic. So my question is, it seems that the air pollution issue in China is under control, but China is still being criticized of lack of ambitions in terms of carbon emission. The current goal for Chinese government is to reach net zero by 2060, and most of the European country or United States have the goal of reach net zero in 2050. Do you think Chinese government in the near future will adopt the same kind of approach as they do in the air pollution area in carbon emission, or are they gonna use a very different approach, a very different system? Let's say they have a newly announced emission trading system. Would that be very different from their management in terms of air pollution?
So that's a really interesting question, which goes in many, many different directions. So, I mean, so carbon control is very different than air pollution control in the sense that there are a lot of cost-effective ways to actually deal with carbon control as opposed to having to put expensive equipment at the end of pipe. So, and also the more you control carbon, the less air pollution you have to deal with, which is a big motivator, I think, in China. So I do think in some sense this similar methods are used in that I do think standards and quotas are a big part of how the Chinese government actually manages carbon. The emissions trading system is not a big cause of reductions. The big cause of reductions in China are things like renewable energy portfolio standards requiring power companies to invest in renewable energy or requiring them to invest in nuclear and in hydro and all these non-fossil sources, right? It's energy efficiency standards. Huge part of China's climate change efforts have been, you know, the 1,000 Enterprise Program and then the 10,000 Enterprise Program, which were all about improving energy efficiency in the Chinese industrial sector. Again, set with clear standards where there's an actual number, a cap, but also those programs had like incredible detail in terms of you have to have an energy committee for your facility, you have to have somebody in charge. I mean, there was a lot of thinking through what the logistics of getting to real implementation were that I think has been an important part of it. There's a big part of the program that's mandates about sustainable transportation, right? So huge push for EVs, but the most important one, I think, has been the investment in rail, right? So I think the number one thing that China does not get enough credit for in the world is the high-speed rail system, right? Every single train between Shanghai and Beijing is 5 plane flights averted, right? There's 1,500 people on each of those trains. That's 5 airplane loads of people, right? And one of those runs every 10 minutes. Think about how many people would have been flying if those trains, some of them would have still taken the train, but an awful lot of business people are now regularly taking the train that we're flying before, right? Between Beijing and Shanghai, between Shanghai and Guangzhou, I mean, it's incredible. And the network now extends to tertiary cities. So, and similarly, there's like 30-something cities in China with subway networks now. They've put a lot of investment into improving bus networks so that most people are not driving electric vehicles. In a city like Beijing, they've driven most of the cars off the road and people are back on electric bikes because they started charging people for parking. Always a good way to control city traffic. So I think it's going to be more of those kinds of mandates. It's going to be quotas. I don't actually think emissions trading is going to be an important part. But back to the other part of your question, which was China's lack of ambition. I mean, I think the big concern has not been the 2060 target. It's been the 2030 peaking target because everybody believes that China can peak earlier than 2030. And the modelers in China have felt that it could peak earlier. Some of them feeling like with some extra effort, they could have peaked as early as this year, right? And that's coming from their own modelers. So the issue is short-term ambition, not long-term ambition. Now, I think in China, these long-term goals are meaningful because of the way the planning process works. But I think within the international community, they're discounted to a certain extent because in a country like the United States, they're utterly meaningless, right? I mean, what Joe Biden says we're going to do in 2050 just has no political importance whatsoever, right? But I think what happened, because I was a little disappointed with the 5-year plan goals, and I thought, well, They're probably holding something back for Glasgow. And I think what happened is that the U.S. everybody was expecting Biden to have some kind of new climate plan that the Chinese would then respond to with their own increased ambition. And then the U.S. once again failed to ever have a program. I think they were keeping something in their pocket because they didn't want a repeat of Copenhagen, where they got pilloried. They had made a major new commitment 2 weeks before Copenhagen, and then got pilloried for not doing more at Copenhagen. So I think they still have something in their pocket that they could do. And the problem is us, that if the US actually did something, because I have no doubt if we had actually done Build Back Better, and we're investing very heavily in electric vehicles and more renewables and moving to new technologies, the Chinese government would have responded competitively by doing the same. And the problem is we're not doing it. But now the problem is maybe the whole world's going into recession. That will lower emissions, but not in a good way.
Wow, a lot to think about. Well, please join me in thanking Deborah Seligsohn for fantastic talk. Thank you.